called Introduction to Feminisms. We have two sort of main points and intentions for today's talk. First is to learn about the various formations of feminism and their various interpretations. And second, to demonstrate the importance of feminism in and out of debate. I want to put just a little note that matters of gender and sexuality are often difficult to learn about in classroom spaces. They're often very intimate and personal. So if you want to talk to me about anything before or after or during the talk, feel free to talk to me about anything, but also just make sure to know that if you need to just take a space outside for a second, catch a breath, get a drink of water, go to the bathroom, that's totally fine. If you're going to be longer than 5-ish minutes, let me know. But yeah. Also, I wanted to let you know that the lecture is organized by a series of key points, including a series of quotations and book citations. I formatted this like it's a college lecture, but I'm going to try to break it down for you as best as possible. Okay, cool. So I'm going to just dive right in. Key point number one that I have for you is that feminism is multifaceted. There's lots of variations. There's a lot of different peoples doing projects that can be named feminism. A lot of people sort of organize feminism in discussing feminism as a matter of waves. And I think that's a very interesting thing to think about. But I want to push you to think about how that those waves, just because there are certain moments of intensity that can be sort of labeled as a wave of feminism, waves have multiple origins, and there's lots of different variations within those waves. Waves come in all different forms. There's tidal waves, there's ripples, and just because there are certain feminisms that have been centered or sort of made visible in the mainstream, that doesn't mean that those are the only formations of feminism occurring. On this key point that feminism is multifaceted, I want to also mention that the presencing of certain feminisms in the mainstream have also often led to the absencing of alternative forms of feminism. So similarly to how LGBT movements sort of have moved from Stonewall and sort of riotous, sort of revolutionary tendencies to sort of fight for military rights or gay marriage through assimilationist discourse, feminism has also had sort of a long history of respectability politics, or sort of assimilationist goals as the sort of basis of feminism. And I want to think through that relationship and sort of different debates that are held within feminism. Okay, cool. Key definition, 1. My personal definition of feminisms, or feminism, that feminisms are a grouping of scholarship, activism, and practices that work to challenge interpersonal and institutional gendered violence. Okay, so let's break that down. So feminisms are a grouping of scholarship, activism, and practices. So scholarship, right, oftentimes we think about that just in the context of academic scholarship, so feminist scholars within the university. But also I want to make note that a lot of feminism also comes from sort of DIY feminism, what we call zines oftentimes. So zines are just sort of made DIY magazines. So if you're interested in looking at sort of more grassroots feminism, I highly recommend doing some searches for some feminist zines and to think about how feminism hasn't just been done through scholarship book projects, through university presses, but also from just like grassroots people trying to organize around anti-gendered violence organizing. So scholarship, activism. So what I mean by activism is the organizing of sort of feminist tendencies. And then also practices. So what I mean by practices is also just like feminism has developed certain practices. So for example, the slogan, "The personal is political." I often read that as like a practice that one undergoes to sort of situate how state power sort of relates to personal relationships. I mentioned that feminism works to challenge both interpersonal and institutional gendered violence. So interpersonal, here I mean relationships in between peoples, and institutional, I mean as institutional like the state, right? Institutional like the medical industrial complex, institutional like nonprofits, and feminism has tried to sort of relate those two things. So how do we deal with misogyny and patriarchy on the interpersonal level, right? And how do we deal with, and what is that relationship to institutional gendered imposition or gendered violence? Okay, so feminism is trying to sort of think through what is that relationship and how do we theorize the structure that we might call gendered violence. Okay, cool. This is the time for you to talk. I want to sort of brainstorm some ideas. How is gender imposed and how does it regulate sort of everybody? So I just want to sort of think through some ideas there. Yeah?
There's a lot of mainstream media and commonly held cultural ideas like pink is for girls and blue is for boys.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So even things like aesthetics, right? Clothing. Just how stores and how, you know, the world is organized by divisions between men, women, and their alleged dualism. Classroom spaces. Anyone remember like elementary school, they'd be like girls on this side, boys on this side. That's another way it like regulates, you know, us. How about like labor?
I mean, yeah, there's positions that are disproportionately represented. Like there's an abnormally small amount of male nurses for some reason. Abnormally small amount of female like laborers and engineers.
Yeah, and just like the general tendency when you're like being, you know, a child and being raised to like mirror your mother or father. So if your like mother is like doing a lot of dishes, your father's doing like a lot of housework, a lot of times, right, we're sort of raised to understand that that's what our roles are as well. There's a lot to be said here, so we're going to keep on talking about that. But I want to keep that in mind. That also, this is also sort of a key point that I want to bring up, that gender doesn't just affect women, okay? That gender actually regulates everybody, right? That interpolation affects everybody. And just because, you know, certain populations might experience more intensified forms of gender violence, that I want to think and sort of think expansively about how gender regulation impacts everybody, depending on sort of how we're assigned. Okay, cool. So gender imposition as a term is a term I like to use. So instead of just thinking about how gender or things that are regulated as gender are violence, I like to think about gender imposition and about how gender is imposed. So for example, when we look at somebody and we assume their pronouns, right? That's an example of how we sort of impose gender onto other people. Gender imposition also, right, happens at birth. So doctors, a baby is born, and based on a doctor's visual determination, a doctor assigns a gender to a baby at birth, right? So that's an example of gender imposition, right? We have all of these sort of ideas about what that baby is going to look like and act like based on that assignation and that imposition. And it's not just, and it's like so much about clothing, right? We're gonna buy this baby this color clothes because of what they're assigned by the doctor, but it's also so much about what type of life that they're going to live. So this child is going to grow up, and then they're going to go to college, and then they're going to marry somebody, and there's a lot of more expectations that are just like, that exceed just, you know, questions of clothing. So I also want to get you to think about that. Another definition I was trying to think through, this is again a personal definition of just what gender is. And I came up with that gender is an apparatus of power that disciplines society into believing there are two static genders, and that alleged body morphology should determine one's aesthetics, desires, and life choices. I'm going to repeat that one more time. Gender is an apparatus of power that disciplines society into believing that there are two static genders, and that alleged body morphology determines one's aesthetics, desires, and life choices. I like to use the framing of body morphology. So a lot of times people sort of think that like gender is what you decide in your head, and then there's someone's real biological sex. And I want to sort of get rid of that sort of phraseology because of how even that discourse of like your true biological sex is also a form of gender imposition, right? And that even sex, that sex, right, itself is not a binary, right? It's not a dichotomy. It's not one or the other. And so oftentimes people talk more about how we need to think more expansively about body morphology, and morphology just means form, right? So there are different forms of bodies. You know, that's true in a lot of different ways. So instead of just being like, there are two different types of people, thinking more expansively that there are different types of bodies, and that's, you know, cool, and we should allow people to have autonomy over said bodies. Okay, cool. Key point 2, gender categories cannot be separated or isolated from class and racial formation. Key point 2, gender categories cannot be separated or isolated from class and racial formation. Okay, so Marxist feminism, Black feminism, women of color feminism, and queer feminisms are all working towards that theorization, right? That gender categories cannot be separated or isolated from class and racial formation. And this is a mistake that a lot of mainstream feminism likes to make. They say, don't make it about class or race, this is just about gender, right? And I want to sort of really push back against that ideology, that feminism really needs to account for the nuances of how gender imposition operates. And we're going to talk about that throughout this lecture. Okay. Intersectionality. Okay. Intersectionality is a term developed by Kimberly Crenshaw. And it often has been sort of misread, and there's a lot of critiques about how it's sort of been misread. But I wanted to offer you my reading of what intersectionality means, and I'm going to do that here. So Kimberly Crenshaw is not just saying, right, we need to sort of think through how we're sort of verily positioned in context of like privilege. So a lot of times people read intersectionality and they do like activities where they're like, I remember one time I was in a feminist activity, they were like, count your beads. You get one bead if you're, and they were just basically like, count your privilege, right? So they're like, you get one bead if you're class privileged, you get one bead if you're a man, you get one bead if you are able-bodied. And it was a really kind of way in which it was sort of naturalized, those sort of positions. Instead, I wanted to sort of demonstrate that Kimberly Crenshaw is more talking about actually institutional redress and the ability of gendered and racial discrimination law in order to address the intersection of racial and gendered violence. So I'm going to break that down. Okay, so redress. Anyone know what the word redress means? Redress kind of just means solution. Okay? So civil rights era happens. There is racial discrimination sort of avenues in order for racial violence to be redressed with using the court system, right, and institutional law. At the same time, there's feminist movements pushing for gender discrimination law in order for one to be able to file gender discrimination law in a court of law. Okay? And so Kimberly Crenshaw is actually a critical race scholar, and she's a lawyer. So she was actually trying to think through how both of those sort of discrimination pathway options can't account for the nuance or the multiplication of violence that occurs at that axiom, particularly at the relationship of blackness and womanhood. Okay? So all of that to say is that she's actually trying to make a lot more of an in-depth argument that's just like, you should look at your race and gender. She's actually trying to critique institutions and how gender and racial discrimination lawsuits occur that can't account for that maximization or intensification of violence that occurs at the intersection of racial and gendered violence. And if that was above your head, don't worry about it. That was very advanced, but that's my reading of intersectionality. So just be careful. When you're using that word intersectional feminism, it doesn't just mean you should always say, you should give like a list of identities. I guess that's the best way to say it. That's a sort of misreading of intersectionality. Intersectionality has a deep sort of anti-institutional and sort of anti-reform sort of components that are integral to intersectionality. Okay, great. Key point 3. Mainstream feminism has had a bad history with the way in which it has reified the male-female dichotomy, and such reification of this binary has created violence against trans people, in particularly transgender women. Okay, so in 1979, this feminist, yes?
Can you just like write that on the board or like re-say it?
Yes, I'll say that one more time. Key point 3, mainstream feminism has had a bad history with the way in which it has reified a male-female dichotomy. Such dichotomy has created violence against trans people, in particularly transgender women. Sounds good? Okay. Yeah. In summary, mainstream feminism has a bad history with transphobia. Okay. And in 1979, there's a pretty famous feminist, white feminist named Janice Raymond, who wrote the book called The Transsexual Empire. And following this book, there was a huge debate in the 1980s where a lot of cisgender women were participating in trans misogyny in the name of feminism. The gist behind this type of feminism was that trans women were intruding into spaces meant to be protected spaces for women. In this case, only women assigned female at birth. Such politics are demonstrated by the series of conflicts over the Michigan Women's Festival, which was a women's only music festival in Michigan, where cisgender women defended sort of exclusive women's space, or sort of women's land, and positioned trans women as violent invaders, right? So in that project, right, they were imposing the idea onto trans women that they didn't have autonomy over to determine their gender, and that their reading of biological sex predated or sort of overimposed trans women's right to identify as women. And yeah. So sometimes, I also wanted to note that sometimes this violence that we might call transphobia illuminated itself as a violent rejection, right? So being like, you have to get out of this space. But I also wanted to note that a lot of that time, that violence was also subtle. Okay, so oftentimes there would be women that would be like, you can be here, but they would have like ask invasive questions, or they would create sort of particular standards that trans women were required to have. So for example, we only really accept trans women that, you know, are passing or have had sex change operations, or are displaying sort of normative modes of femininity, or they'd be reaffirming a conflation between body morphology and womanhood. Okay, so for example, basing feminism just based on questions of morphology instead of theorizing things like gender imposition. So they would be like, right, this is demonstrated in the Women's March. I'm like, feminism means pussy power. So they conflate a particular form of body morphology with feminism. And I want to push back against that sort of tendency as well, for how it can sort of reify or recenter cisgender women in feminism. Okay, great. Concluding to this point, trans feminist theory and transgender studies comes in response to such trans exclusionary histories. Okay? So while this transphobia was deeply violent to trans women, one actual benefit of it was that it actually sparked a lot of trans women to write about being transgender women. And there's two particularly important transgender women that were writing at the time, Susan Stryker and Sandy Stone. So both of them write in response to trans exclusionary feminists such as Janice Raymond. So if you're interested in writing about that, reading about that.
Can you repeat the authors?
Yeah, absolutely. Susan Stryker and Sandy Stone. And if you just do some basic Google searching, you'll find their most read authors, or most read articles. And they are wonderful. Okay, key point 4.
Wait, hold on one sec, please.
Mm-hmm. practices, on the whole, cannot account for the specific nuances of gendered violence, in particularly the relationship between racialization and gendered violence. Okay? Universalized feminist practices, on a whole, cannot account for the specific nuances of gendered violence, in particularly the relationship between racialized and gendered violence. And what I mean by universalized feminist practices, when something is offered as a universal solution, it means that it equally applies or is equally accessible to everybody based on their position. So a lot of, for example, white heterosexual feminists in the 1970s, right, once again sort of repeated this notion that like we all just need to come together as women, regardless of race. And that's what I mean by a universalized position. They're like, actually don't look at racialization, we should just have a universal sort of feminist politic. And so I want to push against that notion as well. Okay? Central to Black feminism was a collective called the Combahee River Collective. Combahee River Collective.
How do you spell?
C-O-M-B-A-H-E-E. River Collective. And they actually published a piece in 1973, and they were Black feminist socialists. They are Black feminist socialists, a grouping of Black feminist socialists that were rightfully critiquing, particularly feminists in the 1970s that were endorsing lesbian separatism or sort of any sort of feminist separatism argument. And so they had sort of 2 points. They were upset with how white feminism would not account for the racism of white feminist spaces. And they were also upset about the universalized attack on men, that they particularly disagreed with how it positioned men of color, particularly Black men. Okay. So for example, racism of white feminism movements, right? We could, right, not understanding the nuances of women of color, right, and particularly of Black women. But also, again, the positioning of we hate all men also sort of reified a racism that mirrored the relationship between white women, you know, calling all men rapists, that particularly affects men of color, right? So Emmett Till, murdered, right, because a white woman, right, reported that he whistled at her, right? So that sort of all men bad argument was particularly weaponized against men of color. And so Combahee River Collective was like, whoa, 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 right? Yes, we agree as Black feminists that we need to critique, for example, particular forms of misogyny that we might experience from Black men, right? But for white women to say, I threw my ring, to say, you know, we refuse to ever, all men are rapists, that also feeds into white supremacy. Okay. Key point 5. Feminism theorizes the alternative. Great. Oh, I love this point. Feminism is really great at trying to think through the alternative. Feminism is expansive. One thing that feminism as a field of scholarship has had throughout its history has been a deep dedication to the project of theorizing the question of the alternative. And this is very helpful for debate, okay? So this is also why feminism has had a problem and lots of critiques, right? Is because they've really been invested on, if we theorize what is gendered violence, then what is the outside? What is the beyond of such structure? So that's why feminism has had a lot of debates about equality versus equity. So like, should we just all get equal pay, right, or do we need equity? I.e., you know, affirmative action. Debates between reform or revolution, right? Should we reform the medical industrial complex, or do we need something completely different? And assimilation versus separatism, right? Should we assimilate or should we separate? Okay, so if feminism has been interested in theorizing gendered violence as a structural phenomena affecting both the interpersonal and institutional, right, what does it mean to not participate in that structure? that's a really important question that there's no definable answer to, right? That's why feminism is still needed, right? That we need to press further into those questions about what is the alternative. Right. And I actually think that's why I really support reading feminist arguments in debate, because it gives you an opportunity to be a feminist scholar and propose an alternative, right? And debate it out. Because there are, pros and cons to different feminist strategies, and there's lots of, grounds to talk about what it means to engage in feminist politics. Cool. My next section is called Key Authors and Books to Read in and out of debate. I've already mentioned a few of my favorite authors, and I'm gonna go into some more. Okay. The first book I recommend is a new book that just came out this year. It's by the author Marquise Bey. And the book's called Them Goon Rules, Fugitive Essays on Radical Black Feminism.
Can you repeat that?
Them Goon Rules, Fugitive Essays on Radical Black Feminism, where Marquise Bey sort of reads together black feminism and trans feminism, and he offers the position of sort of a politics of fugitivity. So I'm going to read you a few quotes. Okay. So page 67, Marquise Bey writes, you could take notes on this or you could just listen or whatever. He writes, It is just about impossible for me to think radical gender politics outside of the black radical tradition. I thought out loud for a yearning for the otherwise, for otherwise than being, as the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas would say, a way to inhabit ourselves in a radically different way, illegible to current scripts of embodiment. I am curious, always curious, thinking perhaps otherwise, about how it might be possible to understand our genders otherwise. Curious about how we might do gender differently, how we might enact genders as on the run from hegemony. I think, fugitive genders. Okay? Right. Hegemony, right? We know this term from international relations, right? But also, hegemony is also about interpersonal violence, right? Or it's also on the level of the interpersonal, right? If hegemony means sort of complete dominance, we can sort of think about gender imposition, right, as a form of hegemony, right? And so I really like that. He's like, I really want to enact genders on the run from hegemony. So if hegemony is here, a sort of fugitive politics is one that sort of runs away from hegemonic gender imposition. Fugitive genders are those genders that might arise, but for the hegemonic regime of gender, self-determination and agental subjectivity that refuses to be bounded. Okay? So if gender imposition is also about a form of bounded sort of gender identification, so even in like trans-inclusive feminism and trans-inclusive spaces, a lot of times we're still sort of stuck with the notion that once you identify as a gender, that it's a bounded category. So I think one of the big things that Bey is trying to say is that we need to break through that notion of bounded gender in the first place. And I think that's really expansive. This is also a very new text, so there's not that many people that have cited this work, but I think that this work will be cited in the future and do a lot of awesome things. Okay, I'm going to read one more quote from page 68. A radical gender politics that reaches for the otherwise is an undoing of the fundamental bedrocks of whom we have come to believe we are. And it is terrifying, holding the potential for both the dangerous reactive and the dangerously revolutionary. The extent to which we continue to rest our heads comfortably in the normative constitutive tenets of imposed genders is the extent to which we uphold the empire. Can we extract the portions of the corrosive regime of gender that delight us and affirm us without upholding the entire empire? I grapple with even daring to provide an answer. So once again, Marquise Bey is connecting the interpersonal regime of gender to the institutional and perhaps structural sort of notion of an empire. Okay, so this is like really good for debate because you can connect like a criticism of like US hegemony and US empire, US imperialism, with the ways in which that institutes normative gender imposition. Cool. And we're going to talk about at the very end of this about how to apply it to this year's or this topic of debate. Okay, cool. Next book I recommend, Riley Snorton is the author. I also wanted to note that I have a Google Drive of all of these PDFs for the most part that I'm going to link to you at the end. Okay, so, but Riley Snorton's book is called Black on Both Sides, and examines the relationship between blackness and transness, and sort of also does a theorization of fugitivity. I also wanted to mention in this book that Snorton has a chapter on Hortense Spillers, an integral figure to Black feminism, particularly her article, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe. Who has heard of Hortense Spillers? Cool. That's totally cool. She's a really great Black feminist and very integral to theorizations about anti-Blackness and gendered violence, okay? So a lot of Black feminism arguments. Frank Wilderson is actually very indebted to Spillers as well. She would definitely be sort of known within the field of Afro-pessimism, but is particularly thinking about gendered violence and its relationship to anti-Blackness. Okay, so Spillers in her piece, I'm going to read you this quote, and this was written in, I believe, 1987, so it was a while ago. And she writes, "The New World marked a theft of the body, a willful and violent separating of the captive body from its motive will, its active desire. Under these conditions, we lose at least gender difference in the outcome, and the female and male body become a territory of cultural and political maneuver, not at all gender related and gender specific." Okay, that's from her article, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, an American Grammar Book. Okay. She is very complicated to read. So hence why I wanted to offer you Snorton's book, because Snorton does a sort of reading of Spillers to think through the relationship between anti-Blackness and gender imposition. So as a very basic argument, Spillers sort of says that chattel slavery sort of ungendered captive slaves. So those stolen from Africa and brought to the United States through the Middle Passage were ungendered or sort of lost gender differentiation on the American plantation. So particularly labor and forced labor on chattel slavery wasn't gender specific, okay? So a lot of white feminism has sort of positioned how labor roles are different, right? Women are sort of in the position of the home, whereas men are sort of, right, to go get are sort of outside of the home or sort of integral to protecting the home. And Spillers is trying to say that regardless of gender identification, Black people incarcerated, or I guess Black people enslaved in American plantations experienced labor regardless of gender division. So there wasn't a delineation between who was required to, for example, work in the fields. That Black women were absolutely required to do physical labor on American plantations. Particularly, she notes that gender specification for the non-captive, and what I mean by that is free white people, also emerged in cement in the time of chattel slavery. Okay, so for example, if you think of like Gone with the Wind, that also white gender normativity also is implicated by the process of chattel slavery. So for example, in the American plantation, the white mistress is becoming codified as a standard of purity and innocence, and the white man is codified as the protector of his sort of mistress and children, symbolizing his own future. So if anyone's read Lee Edelman, a lot of times Lee Edelman talks about reproductive futurity, right? So an analysis of sort of white reproductive futurity is also about sort of that imposition of the gender binary as sort of integral to the American plantation. If that was confusing, I'm sorry. But I just think it's really important to sort of think through that there's a really strong relationship between anti-blackness and gender imposition, right? Because even our norms about what it means to be, for example, a proper woman is implicated in racialization. So like a proper woman, you know, wears a nice dress and has her hair done in particular ways, and those are deeply racialized phenomena. Cool. Great. Cool. The next book I have to recommend is a book called Trapdoor, Transcultural Politics and the Politics of Recognition. Trapdoor, Transcultural Politics and the Politics of Recognition. The politics of recognition is an important phrase in critical debate because oftentimes critical affirmatives are sort of like, these group of people have been left out and that they need representation, okay? This is particularly relevant to trans people. There was a moment in about 2014, 2015 that was called the trans tipping point. There was a lot of discourse that was like, trans is the new civil rights issue, that if more people or if more trans people are made visible or sort of recognized by the media, then that will lead to trans liberation, okay? So there was a sort of liberal sort of notion of recognition that implicated trans politics. It was like, right, if only we had more trans stories, then we would somehow be liberated. And I don't think there's a necessary problem with recognition, but oftentimes that sort of politics of what we call politics of recognition becomes an endpoint, okay? So once there becomes a representation of women or trans women or women of color, that means that oppression has halted, okay? So if you're interested in sort of thinking through politics of recognition, this book about Trapdoor, it's a book I recommend. I'm gonna read you a quote. Okay. Representation is said to remedy broader acute social crises ranging from poverty to murder to police violence, particularly when representation is taken up as a teaching tool that allows those outside or immediate social worlds and identities to glimpse upon some notion of a shared humanity. To the degree that anyone might consider such potential to exist within representation, one must also grapple and reckon with radical incongruities, as when, for example, our transgender tipping point comes to a pass at precisely the same political moment when women of color and trans women of color particularly are experiencing marked increased instances of physical violence. Many of these essays, conversations gathered in Trapdoor attempt to think through this fundamental paradox, attending to implications for the political present and the art and the historical past. Okay. The basic gist of this quote is, what does it mean when 2015 Time is saying this is the trans tipping point, and also 2015 had the most amount of documented murders of trans women of color? Does that make sense? So thinking through that legacy of just like, representation can actually be a very violent thing for trans people, particularly because it often leads to like forced disclosure or like forced outing. And so that representation, or just like this notion of trans people becoming more visible as an inherent good, oftentimes should be sort of pushed back against. That like maybe we need to think a little bit more deeper than just like having a TV show with a trans character. Even though I like that, I like TV, so I'm like kind of always about seeing like different representations, but also it's like that can't be the end point, if that makes sense. Cool. I'm gonna talk about Judith Butler now. Okay, Judith Butler is a really important feminist and queer scholar. The two kind of books I recommend, Gender Trouble and Bodies That Matter. Judith Butler is really indebted to Michel Foucault. So Michel Foucault's sort of main basic argument that is very integral to critical theory is that power is not just disciplinary, but also power is productive. So power produces certain phenomena. It doesn't just sort of disciplinize the world. Okay, so Judith Butler in Gender Trouble and Bodies That Matter makes a few arguments. First is that gender is a performance built through repetition. Okay, a lot of people sort of misread Butler to just say that gender is a performance. And like, you know, you go on the stage and then you go off the stage, and gender is a costume. And a lot of people were like, Judith Butler is transphobic for that because gender isn't just a costume, right? But that gender, you know, is really real. And I think that that's kind of a misreading of what Judith Butler is saying, so I'm going to push back against that and sort of focus on that second part. That gender, yes, is a performance, i.e. it has a lot of aesthetic sort of components and is about sort of performativity, but that it's built through repetition, okay? So it's not just that gender is a costume, but rather that gender sort of replicates itself through repetition and particularly imitation, okay? So one quote from Judith Butler says that there is no original or primary gender a drag imitates, but that gender is a form of imitation for which there is no original. There is no original or primary gender drag imitates, but gender itself is a kind of imitation for which there is no original. Right, so the context to this was that oftentimes women, cisgender women say that drag queens are imitating women. And it's just like, what do you mean by that? Because even your notion of womanhood is also a form of imitation, right? There's not an original, real form of womanhood, right? And that to believe so is to sort of naturalize gender itself. To go back to the beginning, right? How we talked about how gender, we sort of learn it, right? We aren't just born a gender, right? We're raised a gender, okay? So that gender has a form of time, okay? And there's not an original sort of truth about gender, but that it happens over a process. So that performance of gender happens through its repetition, right? So we can see this in pronouns, or like, for example, pronouns. Babies grow up and they constantly hear gender pronouns attached to them, right? She or he. And through time, the majority of people identify with those pronouns. And that's totally cool, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But also, we have to sort of think through how that process occurs, okay? Because for some people, those pronouns don't work, right? Or those pronouns are a form of imposed sort of practice. Okay. Cool. Judith Butler, any questions? It's a very short summary, but just the basic thing that Butler is sort of trying to make is that we need to stop thinking that there are real, truth, sort of true performances of womanhood and manhood, but that we need to sort of all situate ourselves within a sort of project of how those things are formed over time. Cool. The next book I recommend is a book called Captive Genders. So particularly in the context of debate topics, this book is really important because it makes a claim that queer and feminist practices need to be abolitionist. And the term abolitionist refers to sort of the radical politic of being anti the prison industrial complex and, for example, the military industrial complex. So instead of trying to reform prisons or reform the military, this book sort of offers the alternative that we need to sort of abolish forms of incarceration in and of its totality. Yes. There was a new edition in 2017 that was released with CC McDonald having a new forward, who's a black trans woman that was incarcerated in 2014 for an act of self-defense. But I really recommend going to her forward because if you're trying to ever find a form of feminism or a form of scholarly feminism that's sort of in between theory and sort of DIY feminism or sort of like, feminism that's a little bit more easier to read, CC is great, okay? So Cece is definitely a prison abolitionist, but she's also a queer and trans feminist. So for her, she says that in a post-prison world, we will have free cookies for everybody, unicorns, and really cute clothes. It'll be a transtopia. And I was like, I really like that line. Because she's just like, right, yes, I want to abolish prisons, but like our endpoint also has to be include the things that we want. So when we're building our alternatives, one thing about queer and trans feminisms is about how actually we need to desire the things that we want. So for Cece in this quote, she really likes cookies, she really likes unicorns, and she really likes cute clothes. So like I really just love how she's sort of playing with that question of theorizing the alternative. So one tip I have for you for reading feminism arguments in debate is to think through that process of what is the sort of alternative world that we want. Right? If gender sort of imposition and gendered violence is really encapsulating, really controlling, it really feels like it's everywhere, right? What are we working towards, right? How do we get beyond that sort of capture that gender sort of emplaces us within? Okay, cool. Transgender Studies Quarterly is the next thing I wanted to bring your attention towards. It's an academic journal that was started in 2014 by a group of transgender scholars, sort of speaking out of gender studies. And the reason I wanted to mention Transgender Studies Quarterly was that if you want sort of an intro text to trans feminisms, their first article their first journal edition was basically a list, or it was about 90 entries, about one page sort of summaries of sort of key terms within feminism and trans feminism. So it gives you, definitions of cisgender or cis heteronormativity. Gives you also definitions of like things like gender surveillance, or it also has some like other critical phrases like lines of flight if you're into Deleuze. Like it sort of does some cross-disciplinary sort of definitional work. That's like really easy to read, and again, I have that in a folder that I'm going to give to you at the end of the lecture. Okay. The next author I wanted to talk about is Sarah Hamid. Okay, so Sarah Hamid, oh shit, my goodness. Okay, I gotta get through this. Feminist Killjoy is often her most primarily read work. A quote, "To become feminist is to kill other people's joy, to get in the way of other people's investments." I like that. She also has this piece in 2016 called Affinity of Hammers that talks about how if the world is constantly hammering away at us, chipping away at us, she says that we should sort of embrace those hammers and chip away at the system, which I really like that sort of analogy, right? So the interpersonal violence, the world, the empire, gender and the empire are sort of chipping away at us. How can we sort of use those tools against that said system? So if you're interested in that, I really recommend that PDF as well. Okay, great. Last section, key interventions for debate, how to use feminist theory to win debates. Last section, key interventions for debate, how to use feminist theory to win debates. First, I wanted to make a note that debating gender is super, super hard. It's super intimate. As students and debaters, sometimes we don't even know what we are all processing in the world, or how gendered violence affects us. So given that sort of uniqueness question, I like to say that debate is a place to sort of theorize and think through how you're positioned in the world. So debate is a site where you can propose a theory of how the world works and provide a method of action. If you want to read gender arguments, I want you to know that it's not an auto win, and it's often a very hard process. For me, I've gone through a lot of different forms of feminism in my debate career in order to reach the place of knowledge that I am now. So oftentimes, you have to make mistakes in order to learn. So just know, if you're interested in reading feminism, that like it is a process. It's not just like you know it and you're good. So yeah, my first tip is just to stay confident that in that process though. Like know that you will grow, even if that process is difficult. Okay, cool. Second tip, building AC case construction. Okay, so if you're interested in a feminism argument on the affirmative, theorize the topic and propose a reading of the topic that is impacted by what we might call gender. I recommend to think in the direction of the topic and theorize a method you could affirm that would be in alignment of the resolution. I also recommend finding examples you want to talk about that exemplify the power relationships you're describing. So for this topic, there's a lot of writing about the relationship between the military, militarization, U.S. interventionism, U.S. bases, and what we might call imperial patriarchy or imperial misogyny. Okay? So, for example, U.S. bases are across the globe, and they often create a lot of violence towards the women, and then particularly women of color around those bases. So writing an affirmative case about that, about, for example, about the importance of basically Japan regaining military autonomy in order to push out U.S. bases could be an argument that could include an argument about imperial violence and U.S. bases abroad. Feminist international relations is also a good place to go because it often talks about sort of the root causes of war and militarization and its relationship towards sort of cisgender masculinity. And I think that's also an important place to look into. Also, the author Mel Chen, she has a book called Animosities, and her argument reads disability studies, queer studies, and decolonial studies together, and to theorize the ways in which the United States positions Asian countries as a site of toxicity. So for example, toxic toys, but most importantly, also sort of gender variant, or even perhaps violent forms of toxicity. And I think that I have not read that book in about 2 years, so I don't quite know if there's anything specific to Japan. But I just wanted to mention that there is also that fear of Asian countries being irrational or sort of explosive. You could read a sort of argument about queer studies and feminism within that project. J.K. Poir also, their book Terrorist Assemblages examines sort of save the women discourse in war and militarization. So for example, the Afghanistan war, done in the name of like save the women from the sort of backwards Middle Eastern men, is an example of how military is sort of done, even sometimes using feminist discourses to enact anti-feminist practices. So obviously, U.S. intervenes in Afghanistan, and murders thousands and thousands of people, including Afghanistan women.
What was the name of it again?
Yeah, Terrorist Assemblages. Highly recommend that one. And then the last idea I wanted to mention for you for this topic is thinking through the relationship between the foreign and the domestic. Okay? So oftentimes, once again, we think of these as dualistic things, that there's foreign policy and then there's the domestic. And there's a lot of feminists that have written about that distinction itself, about what does it mean to project foreign military troops, and what does that mean in the context of like who is included in the domestic. So the example I like to use here is like the Cold War, right, was about foreign affairs, but also caused a crackdown on the domestic itself. So for example, McCarthyism cracked down on gay people and communists in the United States, because even in the United States, not everyone is seen as a citizen, right? Or not everybody is seen as worthy of being protected. And more importantly, there are certain people inside the nation state that are seen as enemies themselves. So I definitely think there's something definitely there to talk about on the topic as well. My last tip for the negative, if you want to read feminist arguments on the negative, it's really important to sort of develop your theory of power, and then think about link arguments to contextualize the affirmative. So to win a debate on the negative, in my opinion, you need a link with an impact and a method to solve it. You need a link with an impact and a method to solve it. So there's a lot of different affirmatives that sort of naturalize gender imposition. They might have pronouns in their evidence. that naturalize a dualistic gender formation, or they might, in other ways, reinvest in the gender binary. So there's a lot of different arguments you can make there. Or, of course, you can make link arguments to, the affirmative supporting U.S. imperialism or supporting U.S. bases, and make link arguments to that. Okay, cool. Any last questions? I know that I kind of went a little fast, so I'm sorry if I overbeared you with information. Does that make sense about kind of how it's important to sort of resituate feminism, even when it's not because there's in everything we do, right? There are good forms of, politics, and there are some not so good forms of politics. So in this lecture, I just really wanted to sort of emphasize that just because there have been certain forms of feminism that have been violent, that does not mean that all forms of feminism are violent. And so thinking through that relationship is important to develop those alternatives in order to think otherwise. Okay,